今天早上的议程如同昨天，是我们的主题演讲系列，题目是同儕的视野与力量，在降落伞计划中的学习。And now we will begin our keynote speech for today. Our topic is the power and perspectives of peers, what we learn from Parachute. 这场我们邀请到的讲者有2位，一位是意图性同儕支持 IPS 董事 Chris Hansen， 另一位是霍华中心同儕服务提供者 Leslie Nelson。Chris Hansen 是 IPS 的董事，在过去13年来，与美国及其他国家一直致力于教授及发展意图性同儕支持，也曾经担任世界精神医学使用者幸存者网络的董事会成员，并在发展一系列同儕运作的危机喘息及替代方案上扮演了关键性的角色。而 Leslie Nelson 从小生活在一个拥有精神疾病的家族史当中。在受到这样的影响，使他一直活在悲观中，而他的治疗师却鼓励他，相信他可以把同儕支持做得更好。如今，他的使命是可以为同儕支持做出贡献，成为更多人的帮助。We will have 2 speakers for this part, Director Chris Hansen and our peer support provider Leslie Nelson. Chris Hansen is the Director of Intentional Peer Support, has been co-teaching and developing intentional peer support in the United States and in other countries for the past 13 years. She has served on the board of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry and has played a key role in the development of a number of peer-run crises, respites, and alternatives. As for Leslie Nelson, she grew up in a family with mental illness. It was her therapist that introduced peer support to her and believed that she had the ability to provide peer support, which has given her the chance, courage, and idea that she could become the help of this society. In this session, our interpreters will use people with PSD as the abbreviation for people with psychosocial disability in order to save time while translating. 这个阶段，我们要邀请我们的引言人，中央研究院社会所的郝天行研究助理来为我们做引言。For this part, we would like to invite our moderator, Tianxin Hao, Research Assistant of Institute of Sociology in Academia Sinica, to give us a brief introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome her.
大家早安！没想到早上这么多人呢，我还以为大家都会在睡觉。大家早，我是今天就是为大家做这场讲座，同儕的视野与力量的引言人天行。我自己也是很长期的精神卫生资源的使用者，那所以在这边能够为大家介绍Chris Hansen 跟 Leslie Nelson， 然后我觉得很亲切，是因为他们也是很长期的卫生资源的使用者。
So today we are talking about people who have experience in long-term use.
那也很感谢大会刚刚也已经介绍了2位讲者。那在这边是因为我在这边主要是因为对台湾来说，同儕支持可能还是一个有一点新，然后甚至有一点陌生的一个领域或是概念。那就我自己小小的一些实践，跟我自己的一些反思，那还有我自己的一些阅读跟理解，我就在这边跟大家稍微简单的先介绍一下，就是我自己理解到的西方的同儕支持的一个兴起这样子。那西方的同儕支持服务生长出来有个蛮重要历史脉络，是大概是70、80年代的时候的去机构化运动。那先不论就是这个是不是一个什么样，这是什么样的决定去机构化，刚刚有跟Dr. Flo 有聊过，就是先不论这是一个怎么样的历史决定，那总之它促成了大量精神病人从机构回到社区，那加上当时的公民运动风起云涌。然后呢，在社区就集结出了蛮多的病人团体，然后后来就形成2支路线，精神卫生医疗消费者比较倾向体制内改革路线，跟幸存者的运动改革路线比较就等下简单2分法，就是比较体制外这样子。那体制内的 消费者的运动改革路线呢，做了就还包含很多幸存者，当然也同样在场运动里面，就做了蛮重要的一个颠覆，就是复原的概念 recovery， 就是复原的概念，他们认为在他们的各种叙事跟反思中认为 recovery 就不是医疗模式认为的是症状控制而已，就是它应该是一种。就是要回到主体的观点，那不论你有没有症状，如果你能够对自己的生活处境或未来带有某些希望感，然后呢，你跟你自己的生活有所连结，那你已经在复原的历程上了。那复原不是一种某个时间点的结果，它是一个历程。然后里面呢，连结是复原很重要的一个面向，连结就是。以同儕团体来说，同儕支持来说，你的连结是你跟自己有相似的受苦经验，可能是相似的创伤或社会处境。那我们连结在一起，我们一起建立一种彼此一起走向 recovery 的关系。那这是这样的一个同儕支持的一个精神。那像现在在这样的一支运动的推动下，就是复原的观点跟同儕支持也逐渐成为一种新兴的体制内的服务。那当然对台湾来说，我们比较没有这样历史条件嘛，我们没有显著的可以促成就是大量的精神失序者去说出自己的另类观点、另类洞见，有时候可能是跟专业体制冲突的想法。我们可能在这样的空间上条件是稀薄了一些，像我们今天在这边讨论同儕支持，其实很重要的节点是专业人员嘛。就其实还是专业人员，这不一定是不好的，我只是要指出说，这是我们不同的历史条件这样子。那比起有社会运动能量的西方，我们可能就是需要跟专业人员更加紧密一起的去推开一些空间，让失序者的声音能够被听见。而WHO 对于同儕支持的一个说法是，同儕支持的模式是什么呢？就是没有一定的模式，要看着在地的生活跟社群长什么样子，怎么生长出社群。那所以对我们来说，在没有这样的历史条件，然后比较没有相关的一些参照之前，去听听不同的经验，听听不同的地方、不同的历史的人们带来的经验，对我们都是很好的参照。所以今天就也会非常的高兴能够感谢就是Chris Hansen 跟 Les Nielsen 来到这边。那他们呢，刚刚大会已经做了介绍，那我就简单的再为大家介绍一下他们。就是 Chris Hansen， 他是就是出生于纽西兰这样，但在美国工作很长的时间，然后跟同儕支持组织Intentional Peer Support IPS 意图性同儕支持，他是担任 IPS 的董事，然后呢跟 IPS 的创办人Sherry Mead 就一起做了10几年的同儕支持工作。然后 Leslie Nielsen 呢，他目前在 Howard Center 的 START 团队就是做同儕支持的领导，然后也曾经在2013年到2017年担任纽约降落伞计划的同儕支持员，也训练其他的同儕工作者。那这些经验都很期待他们为我们分享。那我们现在就欢迎他们来为我们做今天的演讲。
Ni hao, hello, kia ora, tātou katoa, konnichiwa, and shalom, bonjour, and willkommen from my Jewish, French, and Norwegian ancestors. My name is Chris Hansen, and I live in Vermont in the USA, and as you've already been told, I was born and raised in New Zealand, and I've lived in the USA for about 14 years now. I actually learnt recently that the New Zealand Māori, who are our indigenous people, have DNA links to the Taiwanese people, and which is interesting. They travelled about 500 years ago from the Hawaiian Islands to New Zealand, and so we're obviously a very smart and resourceful people, and I believe that there are some striking similarities between the language and the culture. So that was learning for me. So in some respects, maybe I've come home. It's also my honour and privilege to be co-presenting with Leslie Nelson. Leslie worked on the Parachute Project with me, and I invited her to come because the focus here was going to be on open dialogue, and Leslie has facilitated, I believe, over 400 network meetings, and so she's the front face who's done all of that hard work, and I'm more of the oversight person who can tell you about theory and strategy, and I've overseen the rolling out of training. So in New Zealand, we like to start off with what we call a pakatoki, which is a poem or an inspirational saying or a proverb. And it's a way of honouring our Indigenous people. It's now a way of honouring the multitude of cultures and people that make us up as a nation. It's also a really nice way to create a kind of a sacred container for a time that we're going to spend together. So I'm going to read this to you. It says, Ko tātou ko tahi tanga ki hangia ngā hina kia mahi, me hangiotanga ki te hurihuri o te hoora mo tātou te iwi, which means we unite to strengthen networks to create change and wellness for the betterment of all people. So I am the Director of Intentional Peer Support, and Intentional Peer Support is an organisation that provides training and help to develop peer-run alternatives to mental health services and psychiatric hospitals. At the moment, we are an international organisation. We operate in many countries as well as the United States of America. We also work in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, the UK, England and Scotland, a little bit in Ireland, and we've also got some work in Europe and some other parts of Asia. So what started off as one person just trying to survive and trying to sort of make her way out of a psychiatric hospital has grown rather surprisingly. And actually, I mentioned doing work in Japan, and I was rather heartened and surprised to see Yuki Miyamoto, who was our intentional peer support contact over in Japan, on one of the slides here, and I emailed her last night, and she tells me that she is doing some open dialogue work, partly because she saw the striking parallels between open dialogue and intentional peer support. Yuki is a professor of nursing in the Tokyo University, I think. So I think my invitation here also was linked or acknowledged my involvement with the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it's been very heartwarming to hear that mentioned here in this context, because that's essentially how I got to the United States. I was part of the New Zealand delegation to the United Nations, and I also was a board member of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. And as it happens, the United States has not ratified the convention yet. So I don't very often hear about it in the United States. And the United States doesn't have a tradition of ratifying United Nations conventions. So it's really wonderful to come over and to hear it being talked about, and to hear people talking about human rights and challenging coercive measures. So intentional peer support in many respects provides a template for good relationships. As an organisation, we now train not only peers and people who have people with psychosocial disability. We train many clinician groups, grassroots human rights and activist groups, and we've had requests from nearly 30 different demographic groups to help develop intentional peer support for them. And this is everybody from alcohol and drug, youth, schools, mothers with postpartum mental health challenges, and even at one stage, a group of coal miners with black lung disease, and curiously, the United States Department of Homeland Security. Now, those are requests. We haven't actually gone and worked with all of those groups because we've got a lot of development to do, and we're actually a very small organisation, even though we sound like we're really big. But that's the level of interest that we seem to have raised from a wide range of people in a wide range of both geographic and demographic areas. So how did I get to be here? Well, it's a bit of a surprising story. It was a surprise to me anyway. I ended up getting locked up in a psychiatric hospital when I was in my 30s. And so I had managed to just not get caught up until then. And I had a lot of really big losses in my life. I had some very tragic deaths of very close family members. And I had the loss of a marriage. And I ended up being a single parent with 2 very small children. And I was working very ironically in mental health as a social worker and as a manager in a community mental health service. And everything inside of me just sort of fell apart. And I couldn't think well, I couldn't do my work, and I just couldn't stop thinking about dying. And so when I turned to my colleagues for help and support, their response was to lock me up and to force treat me. And I was in the hospital for over a month. And as a result, it felt like I lost almost everything. And I lost custody of one of my children, I lost my housing situation, I lost my income, I had to go on disability support, I had to get church charity help to help me stay housed, and I basically lost all of my friends. And I was on disability for many years. What I found though was that in the hospital, it wasn't the people who were paid to be there who gave me the hope and the inspiration to keep alive, to keep moving, to keep going on. It was actually my fellow inpatients and the people who sat beside me in the smoking room, which they had in those days. And so I took up smoking because that's where all the really good conversations were. And I decided, partly as a result of the many losses, but also because of the connection that I found in the hospital, that I didn't actually ever want to work again on the other side as a clinician. I felt like I'd found my tribe, and I found a sense of connection and belonging with the people who had been in the hospital, some of whom had spent most of their lives in hospitals, that I'd never felt before in my life. So that transformed me. I also was angry, and so I reincarnated myself as a little bit of an activist from hell, which means that I started to do some activism work in the mental health sector, and I sat on a lot of advisory groups as the patient or consumer or ex-patient rep. And I started to advise at local, regional and national levels, and to do some work with the media. And I became the person who the local or national media would call when there was a major incident and somebody who had psychosocial disability was implicated. So I would be one of the people they would call to get a patient's perspective. And by chance, really, I ended up doing some work at the United Nations and was invited to be part of the New Zealand delegation to the team who were developing the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I went to the United Nations, and I was also affiliated with the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, so I had a fairly radical perspective. And as chance would have it, the chair of those negotiations was somebody from New Zealand, so that meant that I had a bit of power in the negotiation process. And it was a long and arduous process, and it took many years actually, although I was only involved with it for 4 or 5 years. But one of the things that we were doing, there were many things that we were challenging. One of the key things that we were challenging was the idea of forced treatment. And we were working very hard to make sure that forced treatment did not get embedded in a human rights treaty as something that was sanctioned. And what I realized at that time was if I was saying that forced treatment was traumatic and damaging and was less than ideal and should be abolished, then we needed to be looking at creating alternatives that worked. And that's where I found intentional peer support. And I ended up corresponding with Sherry Mead, who was the creator of intentional peer support. And we met at a couple of conferences. And I loved the work. And I also fell in love with Sherry. And we ended up moving over to the United States and working with intentional peer support. And in 2011, Sherry and I got married. And that's another story which I can tell you about at some other time. Anyway, one of the things that really attracted me to intentional peer support is enshrined in this quote, which says, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And that came from a group of Australian Aboriginal activists. And what that says to me is that working together and being in relationships is far more powerful than, for many of us, than having somebody come and tell us what to do, how to be, where to go, what's wrong with us, and what we need to do to get better. And that struck me as being something that was quite extraordinary, and it was what I'd experienced in the hospital. What I experienced was the sense of connection and the sense of community and a sense of respect and love and a sense of hope that was far greater than anything anybody with a clipboard and a pill could provide to me. So that really changed my life. So Sherry Mead, who I'm married to, and it actually established intentional peer support, and she has Parkinson's disease, which is why she's not here talking, or she's not here with me, and so she is not able to work anymore, but supports me, and I feel like I'm the steward now of intentional peer support. So she's at home, and we carry on this work together. So Sherry Mead was diagnosed in her late teens with schizophrenia, which is the catch-all diagnosis that a lot of people were given in those days, and locked up in a hospital and told that she was going to have to live in a group home forever and that she'd probably never work and she'd have to take medication for the rest of her life. And somehow she managed to throw the medication out and run away to Boston and live as a musician for 10 years. And you can live quite well in a fairly extreme state as a musician, because you can stay awake all night, you can sleep all day, and people just say, yeah, she's just a crazy musician. And so that worked for her until she was in her 30s, and she got married, and she was coming out of a bad marriage, and she started to go in and out of the hospital together again. And she was at the time working as a music teacher in a school, and discovered that when one of the children at the school was killed in a car accident, it was a high school, that the young boys who were his friends didn't actually want to go to counselling. They sat in the music room and they wrote a piece of music together, and she discovered that that co-creative process was far more powerful and far more healing than sitting in an office with somebody talking about feelings, which is not what most teenage boys were into. So she decided to go back to school and do a master's in social work, and then did some PhD studies, and discovered working in domestic violence, because that had been part of her experience as well, that people would come out of a bad marriage and people would say, you're strong, you're a survivor, haven't you done well? Why don't you go and see the doctor? So they'd go to the doctor and they'd come out shaking a bottle of pills and say, I'm seriously mentally ill and I've got to take these pills for the rest of my life. And she realised that there was something wrong with that. That what we experience after trauma is a natural reaction. And she decided at that stage that something different needed to be done, and that there must be other ways of making sense of our experience other than just believing that we are now seriously mentally ill, and that's going to continue for a long time. At that time, she also started to go in and out of hospitals, and she started to realise that it only took her 5 minutes in a hospital. This is the way she tells her story. And she was institutionalised. She started to think of herself as a psychiatric patient. She started to behave like a psychiatric patient, and she lost her sense of self. And at that stage, somebody said to her, and I believe it was her psychiatrist actually said to her, Sherry, why don't you start something else? Why don't you do something different? And so she found a small grant for a very small peer drop-in centre, like a very microscopic version of a clubhouse, I gather. And they wrote a grant to develop what they called a peer-run respite, and that is an alternative to psychiatric hospital that is run and staffed by people with psychosocial disabilities. And we now realise that was the first one in the world that was fully peer-run and led. And since then, it's kind of grown, and there are a number of them all around the world. So, because Sherry was actually doing some studies, she drew on a wide range of academic disciplines, and one of the really fortuitous things or lucky things, or maybe it was meant to be, was that the academic disciplines that she drew on were very similar to those that open dialogue practices came from, and those were dialogic practices, family therapy, social construction, systems change, and also a wide range of other disciplines for Sherry, such as anthropology, organisational change theory, sociology, and even quantum physics and chaos theory. So she was inspired by people like Tom Anderson and Michael White, who invited her to co-present with him at a couple of conferences, actually, a long time ago before he died. So it was when Parachute was developed and IPS was written in, it was just, it was good luck and good management, I think, that they were so philosophically aligned with the needs-adapted treatment modality, which was the open dialogue approach that was used in Parachute. So IPS is different from other peer support models because it's not deficit-based, and it's not focused on recovery even, or the promise that one person is needing to get better. Instead, it focuses on the power of mutual relationships. We don't talk about diagnoses or treatment, but we try and deconstruct the biomedical model a bit so that we can find ways to be in relationships together rather than seeing ourselves as deficient and needing to get better. There's other people who are paid to do that, but as peers, we feel that that our role is to connect and to build relationships that are mutual, where both of us are valued and both of us give and receive. And Sherry talks about many of us lose relationships when we get into the mental health system. We get used to always being on the getting end of relationships. And the power of mutual relationships is that they can bring hope and new meaning. And that's really the powerful thing that I found when I was in the hospital, was that it was the people beside me who brought the joy and the hope and the life and the sparks of inspiration to do something different. All right, I'm going backwards now. Okay. So we talk about intentional peer support as learning to ride the waves together. When we run our training, and we have a 5-day training that we call our core training, on the last day we ask every person and sometimes groups of people to do a very small presentation about what they have learnt in the training. It's a wonderful way to summarise the training. It's a wonderful way to embed the learning, because you've actually got to think about it and present it. And it's very entertaining, I have to say. And this was one of the final projects. Somebody drew this piece of artwork. And like many others, it's been incorporated into our materials. One of the things that we've appreciated and enjoyed doing is finding ways to promote local artists and local art, their work, the work of people with psychosocial disabilities. So we sometimes do that in our materials, and sometimes we do that in our newsletter or on our website. So we're not deficit-based. We don't focus on what's wrong. We also say we're not anti-psychiatry either. Our aim is to find ways to enable one another to stay engaged and connected to our lives, our communities, our families, and our senses of self, rather than being vacuumed out of our lives and into the bowels of the mental health system, where many of us lose our sense of self, our friends, our networks, and our sense of being valued and respected citizens. So we like to say we want to break down the assumption that the biomedical model is the only way of seeing ourselves, and we say it's one perspective. And there are so many more. It's like being in a huge mansion and you've got one small room, maybe like a toilet, or the size of a toilet, and we like to say we want to take the walls off that room and to say, look, there's so much more, so many other ways of making sense, so many other ways of navigating your way. And that room that we took the walls off, that's always going to be there. And you reserve the right to go back there whenever it works for you. And there's so much more as well. So, and it's important for us to say this because, as you're going to see shortly, we do take some time to deconstruct some of the ways many of us come to think of ourselves. So, mutual relationships have the power to bring hope and new meaning. Charlie was a young man who had been in and out of hospitals many times in his life. And each time he went into the hospital, he would lose his house, he'd lose his job if he had one, and quite often he lost all his possessions, all of his friends, and had to start up again. And when he discovered that there was a peer run respite available, he was fortunate enough to be able to get into the peer respite when things started to when things started to get difficult for him. And what started to happen was he started to not sleep. He started to find it really difficult to organise himself. He wasn't making a lot of sense to his friends and his family. And so he went into the peer respite, and he was awake for about 4 days and 4 nights, and he just talked the whole time. And the nice thing about the respite was that people worked shifts, so they didn't actually have to be there 24 hours listening to him talk. They could actually switch out. And what Charlie said was that the beauty of that experience was that he was able to make sense of his experiences, and actually he had the privilege of being able to do this with a number of people. So he experienced a number of different perspectives, and at the end of that 3 or 4 days he just slept. He slept the sleep of the dead, and when he emerged, he went back home, and for the first time he didn't stay in the hospital for a long time. He didn't lose everything. And he went on to actually went on and did a master's in eco-psychology and wrote a thesis that included his experiences in the peer respite. And it doesn't mean to say that he never had an experience like that again. He certainly did. But what he discovered was that there were more options than just going in and out of the hospital. And he found other ways to navigate some fairly challenging states, which also had the possibility to be fairly creative states. So what is intentional peer support? I'm going to bring you a very brief overview. And intentional peer support builds itself on 3 principles and 4 tasks. The principles are a shift in focus, and the tasks are things that you can do. So the principles are the attitude or the philosophy or the inner state that we bring, and then the tasks help to break it down into a way to be mindful about relationships. And sometimes I think of it as mutual mindfulness. And sometimes I think of it as like a martial art. And it's really a way of being able to think about my relationships and think about how I'm presenting in my relationships and to break it down in ways that make sense. So the first principle is shifting the focus from helping to learning together. And we think about, what is my purpose in this relationship? So this is quite a big shift for some people, because many of us here have been trained in human services. So we're trained to expect that I'm here to help you. But there's quite a shift in focus between helping and learning together. Helping assumes that I'm an expert and I know what you need, and you just need to come to me and I'll tell you. If we're learning and growing together, then anything is possible. What we encourage people to do in our training, and I encourage you to do this now, is to think about a relationship that you've had with somebody who encouraged you to do something that you found hard, or to do something difficult, or to learn something difficult. So there's got to be a positive relationship, and it's somebody who supported you to do something that maybe you didn't think you could do, or that you were afraid of doing. And to think about, what were the qualities of that relationship? What were some of the qualities of that relationship? And some of the qualities of the relationship that people come back with were, they trusted in me, they believed in me, they challenged me, they had hope, they sat with me, they allowed me to make mistakes. And then sometimes we ask people to think about a situation that was different from that, where you went to somebody for some support or help, and you ended up with little black puffs of smoke coming out your ears because it was not a good relationship. It really just didn't work for you. And what were some of the qualities of that? And often it's that they didn't listen to me, they just saw me as a number or a label, they were patronising, they spoke down to me, they lectured me, and it's a way to think about, what is it that we want to bring into the relationships that we have, not only with the people that we work with, but actually with one another and the people that we love and care about. Because how easy is it when somebody says, I'm having a hard time, to just come in and say, well, you know what you need to do. You just need to do this, 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 and this. And sometimes that's what I need. But often I'm coming to my relationship saying, I'm having a hard time with this because I just want you to listen. I just want you to be present. I just want you to be there and to hear me. So that's quite a big paradigm shift. And even for people doing peer support, shifting that focus from I'm here to help you to let's learn and grow together. You have as much to be able to offer me as I have to offer you is a really big shift. And I heard Jakob say yesterday that when you can change, when I can change, my the person I'm working with, the client, my peer, they can change. So if I'm prepared to change, then the other person can change as well. So the second is shifting the focus from the individual to the relationship. If the focus is on you and what's wrong with you, then the change is one way. And I don't have to do any changing. The outcomes are predetermined. Our conversations get stuck on problem solving, and the co-learning can stop. If we can work together on our relationship, we both change. We risk honesty, openness, and courage. No one is the problem. That's such a big shift for so many of us, to realize that I am not the problem, I am not a problem, I have something to be able to contribute. And the relationship has the possibility of being inspiring. And not just you, but both of us can be inspired. And the third principle is shifting the focus from fear to hope and possibility. So most of traditional mental health services focus on what's wrong and what we want to avoid and what we want to stop doing. And a lot of it is actually based in fear. It's based in what we're afraid you might do. IPS really works to shift the focus from fear, and sometimes through fear, to hope and possibility. And I think that's another thing that we have in common with open dialogue, is a commitment to sitting and being present and finding ways to listen and make meaning, rather than prescribing, stopping, and taking control because we're afraid of something that we think is going to happen. I also heard open dialogue referred to yesterday as dancing. Now, we actually often use similar analogies, although my favourite is actually as jazz music, because I'm a musician. And so just think about in jazz, and I always hold my hand like this. I play the violin, and then I learned to play jazz, so I play sort of blues and folk, and so when I'm going like this, that's the musician in me just speaking. Let's just say we come together with our instruments, and I start to play something, and you say, "No, that's not right. That it's in the wrong key. This is how it goes," and you play it in a different key, which is uncomfortable for me, and it's a little bit of a different rhythm. And so I try and copy you because I really want to please you. And we end up playing a piece of music I follow, and you keep correcting me and saying, "This is where you should go, this is how this piece of music goes." And we play a piece of music. There's no doubt that it's a piece of music. But it's really different from if I play my funky little piece in my funky little key, and the rhythm is a little unusual, and you listen and you kind of respond, and it's uncomfortable for you, but you're doing something that's new and that's different. And so you respond, and I think, "Ooh, that's really interesting, let's try that." And maybe we make a few wrong notes, or not wrong notes, but different notes. There's no wrong in jazz. That's the great thing about jazz music, is that you can just call them passing notes. And so it's all part of the music, and we learn from one another, and we dance with one another. And we play a piece of music that nobody will ever play again, because it's ours. And I think that's one of the beauties of what we're trying to do is that you come with you and I come with me, and together we make something completely unique. Sometimes, and I'm not sure if this is going to translate or not, but sometimes I call it our unique cocktail. And whatever you put in and whatever I put in, it makes this unique cocktail. So, I have 3 challenges, and they're sitting with discomfort, taking risks, and holding multiple truths. And I think that's what we bring that is so unique and intersects so magically with open dialogue. It's often really uncomfortable. It's so much more uncomfortable to sit with one another in our pain and our fear than it is to prescribe and to solve the problems. And sitting together is risky. And sometimes I have to really step outside my comfort zone and to do something really different. And then your truth might be incredibly different from my truth. And the question is, can I hold them both? How can we do that? So the tasks of intentional peer support. The first task is connection. Connection is really intangible in many ways, and yet we all know that we're connected, don't we? And actually we all know when we're not connected. And I often think connection underscores, it should be underneath Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If I haven't got connection, then it's going to be hard for me to survive, and I may not survive. What's the point of surviving if I'm not connected? And yet we don't spend a lot of time in most of our cultures focusing on connection and what it is, do we? Yet if you think to the wonderful relationships that you've had, they're always about connection. And it's such a funny thing. You can have connection in really little ways. You can be walking down the street and you can catch somebody's eye, and there's just this spark, and then you walk on and you never see them ever again, but you're left with that warm feeling. And for many of us, connection is something that we've striven for all our lives. And we've gone in and out of, we've longed for many of us who have used mental health services, that's what it's been about, is about connection. It's about the longing for connection, the loss of connection, the inconsistency of connection, but it's about connection. Sometimes I think of connection as being like when you have like 2 trains and you're passing, and you're sitting in one train and you get a peep into the other train, or you're driving down the road and you peep into somebody's house and you see what is in there. And I think of it as seeing and being seen. And it's something that some of us do very naturally and some of us find very, very difficult to do. So in intentional peer support, we often spend quite a lot of time talking with one another about what is connection and how do you connect, and what are some of the things you do to connect, and what happened in that relationship. It sounds like maybe you didn't connect, or maybe you disconnected, or you forgot to connect, or maybe it was just felt like it was impossible and the hardest thing in the world to do, to connect. Many years ago, I was married in another relationship from the one that I'm in now, and my mother-in-law my grandparents-in-law came from Scotland, and we came from very different cultures, and they didn't like me, which I found hard. And I didn't have great connections in my own family, and I was hoping for good connections in the family I married into, and they did not like me. And when my grandmother was dying, my grandmother-in-law was dying, I asked her a question. I said, "How do you make brawn?" And it's a very Scottish dish involving a pig's head and a big pot. And but her face lit up. And for the one time in both of our lives and in our relationship, I found that window, and I managed to speak her language, and she lit up and she told me all the details of how to make this dish. And it was kind of magical. And I, 40 years later, I'm still telling that story because it was memorable, and somehow I just managed to find the key to the door, and it was just for a limited time only. But it transformed me in a way that I still remember. And sometimes those relationships, you just find a connection. Maybe it's a connection in a mutual experience or a mutual interest. Maybe you can just connect with somebody's pain very briefly, and this magical thing called connection happens. But just as quickly as connection happens, disconnection happens. And there are many things. Okay, so connection creates belonging and deepens relationship. There are many things that cause disconnection. And we've got a list of some of them here. They can include, and this is not an exhaustive list. This list could go on and on and on. But some disconnects happen when I push my own agenda, or ordering about, telling people what to do, cautioning, wanting to make a difference. Now that's a very strange one, isn't it? And it's not all of these are always disconnects. But most of you probably don't want me to come into your life because I want to make a difference. Because that's about me meeting my needs, rather than me entering into a relationship with you. Lecturing. I'm doing that now, but hopefully not in a disconnecting sort of way. Being unaware of our power, and we talk quite a lot about power and the power that we have because of our role. Even in peer support, if you have the title of peer support person, there's power in that. Sometimes peer workers, support workers get paid. I don't know if they do here, but in some other countries they get paid, and there's power in that. And we talk about the power that we have in all sorts of ways. Gender, whether you're male or female, sexuality, your race, your culture, your religion. Those are so age as a kind of power. Disability, or whether you've had diagnoses or not, there's power in that. We talk a lot about wrestling with power and being able to acknowledge and own our power. We all have it in different ways. Praising. Now that's a funny one. We all like to be praised, but praising can also have an agenda to it. If I say to most of you, I do like how well you've groomed yourself today, that might not be a connect, it might be a disconnect, because you might find that patronising, and you might feel that I have an idea of how you should be grooming yourself, dressing yourself, and you might feel a little overpowered by that or resentful. Over-relating, saying, I know exactly how you feel, I know just how you feel, or you've had this diagnosis, I know just what that's like because that's what I've had, or my son has, or this is what I've learned about. Over-relating might even just be about something that we've got in common, and assuming that I know all about you because I know something about something that you've said. But it's an assumption. Sympathizing as opposed to empathizing. Sympathy is really about feeling sorry for somebody. It can be very distancing. It can be about being happy that what's happening to you is not happening to me, as opposed to empathy, which is about seeking to understand. Probing, joking. Humour is a wonderful connector, but it can also be a powerful disconnector. And changing the subject or getting distracted. How many of us have been in the middle of a conversation and suddenly someone's phone rings and it's a really big disconnect. So the powerful thing that I think many of us forget is here, reconnection. That reconnection is almost always a possibility. And most of us have old habits around reconnection. We either blame ourselves or we blame the other person. And I don't know about you, but there are many relationships in my life that I've just let float off into the distance because something's happened. And I've not really thought about whether I can reconnect or not, or whether it's a possibility. And so we take a bit of time to think about what does reconnection look like? How can you reconnect with somebody? What have been the ways that someone's reconnected with you in your life that have really made a difference? What did they do? Sometimes they apologised. Sometimes it's about acknowledging, well, looks like we disconnected, or looks like that really upset you, or I wonder if that really upset you. Sometimes, actually, it just takes a bit of time, doesn't it? Just sort of got to go away, cool down. But it's a practice. I'm not saying reconnection is always the best option, but often it's a forgotten option. We just get upset and we walk away and forget that if I make an effort, it's quite likely possible that we both can learn and grow from this circumstance. I might check out what happened. I might have to own my own part. I might have to apologise for my part, not for everything. But if I can own my part and then discuss what we both need, we can reconnect. So the second task is worldview. And worldview is really about acknowledging that each of us is the sum total of all of the experiences that we've had in our life, and that affects the way that we see the world. And in our training, we often give people a picture, and we ask them to write a story about it. And if we put a picture up on the screen and we asked you all to write a story about it and to make it a creative story, none of you would write the same story. Nobody in the world would probably write the same story, apart from the people who didn't write anything. But they probably had things happening in their head. And that's because each of us are the sum total of all of our life experiences, and we each see the world in different ways. And because of that, we talk about the importance of being trauma-informed. Rather than saying what's wrong, asking what's going on, or saying what's happened. Each of us who've had distressing experiences or are in states that distress other people have a story. There's a story that I have to tell about what's going on for me. And so often it's a story of something that's happened, something that's traumatic, something that I'm longing for, something that I'm yearning for. And if someone can sit down and ask what's going on, it makes the world a difference. So when I think about when I ended up in the hospital, nobody actually took the time to ask that question. And so I ended up losing it felt like almost everything. It wasn't almost everything, but I lost so much. And had somebody sat down with me and said, so what's going on? Tell me about what that's about. I could tell my story. And we might have together come up with a completely different outcome that didn't involve a hospital. It might have involved talking to somebody and taking some time out and finding some creative ways to be supported. But it didn't need to involve a long stay in a hospital that actually meant that so many things in my life just were lost. And actually meant that I ended up sort of cycling in and out of mental health services for quite a long time. And I think that's partly what drives me to do this work. It's like so many of us could have such different lives had somebody just said, what's happened? What's going on? What do you need? What's a story that you're telling yourself? So paying attention to worldview actually helps me to connect. We can think about, how did I come to know what I know? How did I come to think about myself in these different ways? I learned to consider the story behind my story. So I might think of myself as a person with a certain diagnosis. And that's the story I tell myself, but there's a story behind that story. And sometimes that story is a story of, for me, of being in a family where if I cried or asked for my needs to be met, I got locked in the garage and isolated and cut off. And so I learnt not to be able to ask for what I need, and became very separate from my family. And for some of us, it's stories of loss, of abuse, of alienation, I mean, there's a whole huge history behind our stories. And I think that's something that open dialogue does rather beautifully. When I started to learn about open dialogue, I started to think longingly about what would that have looked like in my life had somebody sat down with me and brought my family in and brought the people in my network in and had a conversation about what's going on, all sorts of things could have been different. And we all would have been changed. And I wouldn't have been seen as the problem. We might collectively have had a conversation and seen the world in a different way. All right. So just want to be able to move around a little bit. So this is what we call the circle slides, and this is the way that, actually this is the way Sherry came up with describing the way she came to learn of herself as mentally ill. And it's also the way that we, one of the ways that we use to start to think about what is peer support and how might that change and transform our lives. Thank you. All right, good. And I've managed to turn this off. Here we go. So this is Sherry's story. It's not everybody's story, but this is the way she describes it. So hard and painful things happen. And maybe I hear something like, you're weird, you're bad, you're crazy, you deserved it, it's your fault. And so I learn to act as if. I learn to put on a good face, to act like everybody else, try to fit in. Sometimes I manage, sometimes I don't. And then maybe you come and you say that you like me, you want to be my friend, which is a good feeling. But as Sherry describes it, there's this little thought inside saying, you wouldn't like me if you really knew me. Anybody ever felt like that? And so start to feel split in two. And like I'm holding a deep secret, and the pressure of secrecy builds. Until I start wondering, what the heck is my problem? Or other people start saying, what is your problem? There's something wrong with you. You've got to go and see someone. So I go for help. So I come to you for help. And this is some of the artwork that we use. I can tell you the story a little bit later if I've got time about this beautiful artwork that was done by one of our dear colleagues. And very often in our system, in a very traditional system, overworked, underpaid, I come to you, and one of the first conversations is that you give me a diagnosis. And it's kind of a funny first conversation, isn't it? But in the United States and New Zealand, which are the two systems I know best, that's as much about a billing code, being able to know for the clinician how they're going to get paid, as it is about needing to put me in a box and then tell me that this is what you've got to do. You've got to do this, 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 and this. And I'll give you this pill, and then we've got to work on these goals, treatment plan, and off you go, because I've got to see the next patient. So now I know that there's treatment for what I now come to think of as symptoms. So I came to you saying, I'm feeling really sad, or I'm not able to sleep, or I'm having these thoughts that other people don't understand, or whatever it is. And now they're called symptoms. So sometimes they're not even, it doesn't even feel like they're part of me, they're just symptoms. And so I start thinking of myself in terms of symptoms, and I learn to watch out. And instead of thinking about how do I survive in my life, how do I live well, what does that look like, I start to think about managing my symptoms. So you're the clinician. I call you when I feel out of control because you know all about symptoms and you think I need expert help, maybe even more expert than you. But I figure that you're the expert. I give up my power, I give up my identity, and when things are feeling uncomfortable, I turn to you and I ask you what I need to do, rather than think about what is going on or how can we have a conversation and make meaning of this. So I've got 2 more slides. Peer support in peer support, we can actually end up doing exactly what's been done to us. And that's partly why we believe that it's useful to have some training or some conversations or some ways of collectively making meaning out of our role in peer support together, because otherwise we just do what we know, what's been done to us. So this is one way. I come to you, you're a peer, and we get to know one another and we connect through what we have in common, and it is powerful. That connection can be really powerful when I realise that I'm not alone and that you understand what I've been through. And this is not just in mental health. When I was pretty young, I was in my very early 20s, my father died very tragically in an accident. And most of my friends had not lost people close, parents, and they didn't know what to do. But the people I really connected with were the people who'd also lost parents, or the people who'd lost somebody close in an accident. And that is the power of connecting through that lived experience, whatever it might be. Maybe you went to the same school that you both hated or that you both loved. So we connect and we're having a great time until I start having a hard time. And you worry that you're going to say the wrong thing. So you ask me if I'm feeling safe. You start problem solving. And again, I figure you're the expert. And this is what we aspire to. This is hard to do in actual life, but this is what we aspire to. So we have something in common. We are peers in some way or other, and we listen and we learn a lot about each other until one of us has a hard time. And instead of assessing safety, we struggle with our fears. And maybe I have to own that I don't understand what you're talking about, or that when you talk like that, I'm afraid. And we wrestle with our fears, but we think about what will it take to make this work for both of us. And we negotiate safety between us rather than you taking control because you're afraid. And this is where it becomes like a martial art. We both remain the experts and we both grow. And I'm going to take a risk here and venture into a subject that I normally do on about day 4 of our training. But I'm going to just take this risk. So when somebody talks about suicide and thinking about suicide, I don't know what is standard in Taiwan, but what is standard in many countries is there's a whole assessment process and questions that you ask. Do you have a plan? What is your plan? Do you have the means? You know, it's a whole cycle. And at some stage, you end up going to the hospital. So we talk about suicide, and I can talk eloquently about this because I've thought a lot about dying. It's just something that I'm very familiar with, and it's still a thought that comes up for me, and I'm comfortable with it. Instead of going into that old pattern, which may or may not end up with me in the hospital, we might acknowledge that actually suicide's an action, it's not a thought. It's not a feeling, it is a thought. Suicide is an action, it's not a feeling. So what are some of the feelings behind that thought? And for me, there's a whole range. There's despair, and there's loss, and there's pain, and there's sadness, and for some people there's grief. I mean, we could go around the room and you'd probably, have 40 different feelings. We might talk about, so what is that about for you? Where does that come from? And I might, when we talk about I struggle with my fear, I might have to say, when you say that you want to kill yourself, I'm really afraid. Or I'm in a job where if you say this, this, and this, then I have to do an assessment, or I have to call my supervisor, or whatever. Is that what you want? Or is there some other way that we can talk about this where we can both stay in the conversation? And I tell you what, not many people come and say, I'm feeling suicidal because they want to go to the hospital. Some of us do, the first time maybe, or the second time. And then after that, it's just not kind of so attractive. Usually if I come and I say that, I tell you because there's something I want from you. I'm actually hoping that the connection that I have with you will help me get out of pain. For a lot of us, thinking about suicide, it's a language of pain. Another connection I made yesterday with Jako's presentation was he talked about psychosis as being a survival strategy. And that's right, isn't it? Yeah. And I think thoughts about suicide are actually a survival strategy. That's funny, isn't it? Thinking about dying as a way to survive. But sometimes thoughts about dying are much more pleasant than thinking about what I'm having to deal with right now. And sometimes, in some systems, the only way anyone will listen to me is if I say I'm suicidal. And sometimes, whatever meaning I make about death, whether it's heaven or whether it's nothing or whatever it is, feels a lot more attractive than the pain that I'm in. So it's a survival strategy. And for me, it became an old habit. There's an old habit that's actually still in there. And I've learned to kind of wave at it and acknowledge that this is code for me. There's some big feelings happening, and I might explore what are those feelings, what's going on. So, I've just got my 5-minute warning. So we talk about crisis as being an opportunity for everyone to reflect and change. And I've had hundreds of conversations about suicide, and to date, I've never actually had to call the hospital. The third task is mutuality, and I like to think about mutuality as when you and I are both present in the conversation, when your worldview and my worldview are both in the conversation. That's mutuality. And yesterday we heard about just saying, this is how I feel when you say that. Sometimes mutuality is me saying, I've been there. I know what that's like. I don't know exactly how you feel, but I remember when my marriage broke up or I got hospitalised, I felt such and such. It doesn't mean vomiting my whole life story, but it does mean being able to connect and to acknowledge that this is not unfamiliar to me. You are not alone, I guess, is where I'm going with that. And sometimes it means asking for what I need. So mutuality means not focusing on you and not focusing on me. It means focusing on the relationship. Moving towards is sort of what happens when we're connected, both of our worldview are visible, and it's sort of the alchemy of what happens when we're in a relationship that is learning and growing together. It's not about goals. It's not about any expected outcomes. It's about what is possible, and the possibilities for that are limitless. So intentional peer support is about creating relationships that make it okay for us to not just be in peer relationships, but to use them as a tool to take a bigger look at how we've learned to operate in the world. Those are some quotes from, and actually I'm going to just leave that until after the break. But peer support is, we talk about it being social change because it's about Sherry said, as peer support in mental health proliferates or grows, we must be mindful of our intention, which is social change. It's not about developing more effective services, but rather about creating dialogues that have influence on all of our understandings, all of our conversations, and all of our relationships. And it's about me having a relationship with you and that affecting your relationship with the people in your life, and maybe affecting their relationships with people in their lives, and it having this sort of ripple effect. So I am going to finish there because I think it's time for a break, and I'll see you after the break. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Parachute project. Parachute started in 2012, and Pablo's going to talk a lot about it tomorrow, so I don't want to steal his thunder. But I just wanted to say a few things about Parachute from the perspective of the persons with psychosocial disability who were involved in it. And one of the courageous things about Parachute was that they designed it so that every person who was working in the project was trained in both open dialogue and intentional peer support. And that was everybody from the peer workers to the case managers to the psychiatrists. And it was and Pablo will talk about this much more eloquently than I, but it was an alliance between mobile crisis teams in the city of New York and peer respites that were staffed by peer workers at the time. And I know a lot of you are really interested in it because you've come and told me that you're really interested in Parachute. And I was talking to Pablo this morning about it and saying it ran for 3 years. It was very quick, and it was a bit like when the first plane was built. Wright brothers built the first plane in 1903, and the first flight went for 12 feet, The second flight went for 125 feet, and the third flight went for 200 feet. What they knew was they could fly. Flying was possible. And they also knew that there were many things that needed to be different in order to be able to take off and to fly for a long way. And I feel that way about parachute. We got it off the ground, it was courageous. We know that we can fly, we know we can do this. And there's a lot of recommendations that we now have for what might happen if someone was to do something similar in the future. So some of those recommendations. So this was a project where everybody was trained in intentional peer support and in NATM. And with a big project like this, and I'm just going to sort of go very briefly through some of the recommendations that there are, is just to make sure that everybody is committed to this project, that everybody knows what they're in it for and why they're in it. Policies and procedures need to be in alignment. You can't easily just pull in. I'm only going to talk about intentional peer support because that's what I know. You can't easily pull this into a big system and just have it fit. It's like Cinderella's stepsisters trying to put Cinderella's shoe on, or putting a square peg in a round hole. Actually, there's whole systems changes that need to happen. I would recommend, my desire would be that people with psychosocial disability are involved at all levels of planning a project in a wider system, from writing the project to implementing the project, thinking about what's working and what's not, research, evaluation, every single level. That people working in something like this self-select rather than just being told that you're here because you've been told. If there's a way for people to choose to be part of something that is a big paradigm shift, a big shift in the way of thinking, it's far preferable. It's not necessarily easy to do. One of the things I'm going to keep this kind of brief because it's kind of dry, but I think it's important, and you've got a little outline on your slides there. Is that when looking at employing peers or hiring them or bringing them on board, to think about what are the qualities that we want in someone in this position. So there's a number of ways that people involve peers in organisations. One is to just pick anybody with a diagnosis, to say, well, you've got a diagnosis, you can come on board. And the other one is to pick somebody who actually already has some kind of clinical training. And I have to say, both of those have downfalls. There are qualities that make a person good at peer support. One of those qualities is wanting to do it. One of those qualities is having some skills in being able to relate and connect to people. And actually, it's hard to undo clinical training. Now, obviously, I managed to do it. It's not impossible, but in some respects, for peer support work, clinical training is a bit of a disability. I said to some people at dinner last night, somebody said they wanted to be a peer worker, but they didn't have any schooling, or they didn't have any education, higher education, and we like to say to people, you have your PhD, which means you have your personal history degree. I don't know if that is translatable into Chinese, but that gives a lot of people a lot of hope, and people who come in with lots of letters behind their name, lots of qualifications, they're often a little disabled because it's a shift. It's a shift in thinking. And an ongoing basis. It's useful to have an ongoing learning community to grow together. So one of the things that we found is that because we're thinking about the way we do relationships, it is like a martial art or learning to dance, learning ballet, for example. You can go to a 5-day training or a 10-day training or a 2-year training, but unless you're out there and practicing it, doesn't make you a practitioner of Aikido or a ballet dancer. It requires practice and spending time reflecting on your practice, and often doing that in the company of other people. So that's really important. It's just doing this is more than just a training. If peer workers are going to be employed, I think it's useful to think about how you're employing them. I've already said this. What is the job description? What is it you're requiring them to do? How are you advertising? And if paying people, some of the things that need to be thought about are salary rate, how much you're going to pay them, what rates they're going to be paid. What are the opportunities for moving forward? Is there a career pathway? Are there options to move forward, or do you just sort of stop at the peer role? And what are the resources and training opportunities? And actually, even if you're if people coming as volunteers, I think it's helpful to think about some of these things. What are the options for moving forward? And I will sit down with people who work with me and ask, what are your hopes and dreams? What do you aspire to? How can we support you to do that in your life? Even if you want to be a plumber or an astrophysicist, is there a way that we can support you to do that, so that you're not just stuck being in a peer support role? And the other thing is thinking about how can, if we're employing people or giving people a role because they have had some challenges in their lives, like you've had this experience that has led to a diagnosis, how can we support you with that in ways that are not punitive? And the other thing that I would recommend that I think is really important, I actually had an email about this last night, is as clinicians working in mental health setting, how can you support one another with your own mental health challenges? How can we develop a language and a culture where we can talk about our own struggles and not be ashamed, where we can talk about what's going on and not risk losing our job or being demoted or kicked out of medical school or nursing school? And how can we support one another in ways so that the parallel process or the example that we're setting for the people who we're serving, that we're working with, is not one of shame, but it's one of, this is human experience and we all experience it and we're not going to be ashamed of it. Because when I've had to look for a clinician, I've looked for somebody who is really out about their own struggles, about their own lived experience. I think people should get paid more for it, actually. That's just one of my plots to change the world. And I had an email last night from somebody who's looking to set up a network for clinicians, particularly doctors, I think, who have their own struggles, lived experience, and looking for support resources to be able to support one another, because most of us know that people in those clinical roles actually have a very high rate of suicide, and often I think it's our own struggles that draw us to the job. And so, as I say, I think it should be seen as a qualification and something that we should not celebrate, but be upfront about. It shouldn't be hidden in secrecy. So I'm going to hand over now to Leslie. Leslie, do you want to take the whole hour, or shall I just quickly give them the info about the books and things? Okay, all right. That's so I just wanted to say I wasn't quite sure whether I could bring books or not, and so I did. And I can't sell them, but I have 3 left there, and I'm just saying I'm happy to take a donation for them. It's called Intentional Peer Support, an Alternative Approach. We have a website, intentionalpeersupport.org, which has a lot of resources, in English. It's got videos, articles. There is a peer respite manual. So if you or someone you know is looking to set up a peer-run respite, there is a book about doing so. You can buy it online at Amazon. It's called the Peer Respite Handbook. And there is an electronic copy of that which is free. And I'm going to send it to the organisers to put on the website. But if you want to contact me and ask about any of these things, you can do so at info at intentionalpeersupport.org, and I can send some of that. We have a Facebook page, Intentional Peer Support. There's an Intentional Peer Support Japanese site, and our materials have been translated into Japanese. So if anybody wants the Japanese material, email me, and I can send you the contact. The contact is Yuki Miyamoto. So I think most of you actually know Yuki. A lot of the people from Japan know Yuki, so if you know how to get hold of her. I've got brochures and postcards and fridge magnets on the table outside. Please take them. I don't want to take any home. So help yourselves. And as now, with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to Leslie, who has been doing this important frontline work and can put skin onto some of the bones that I've just given you.
I want to first open with some remarks about thank you so much to the Eden Foundation House Fountain House for organizing this amazing opportunity to have this very, very important conversation. Cross-disciplinary dialogues and diversified support models. Frankly, I can't think of anything more important or more exciting. It's my favorite thing to think about. I want to thank Chris for inviting me to be here. And when I think about how did I get here, I have absolutely no idea. So I'll start there. Some of you have the materials, and you'll see that my slides are not particularly sophisticated. I think what we want to do is come together and really embrace the idea that if each of us in this room were having this conversation together, as opposed to me being up here, we would all have something to contribute. We would all have memories of our own experiences, or we would have memories and feelings of family members or community members, and we would become able to talk about that more openly and with each other, which is very much my preferred way of interacting with people. This makes me very uncomfortable to be so separate from everybody out there. So it makes me very nervous and very uncomfortable to be up here because I feel like I'm not a part of all of you. So help me get through this and not be so nervous. Thank you. I'm much more for dancing up and down the aisles and in and out and speaking in strange rhythms and that sort of thing. I was really struck yesterday when Jaco was talking about some of these very, very basic and simple principles about open dialogue work. I too have studied and love the work of Bakhtin and various others and have embraced these really great thinking and thinkers about how we communicate and how we don't communicate. And I was so struck when Jaco was talking about the baby that has no ability to talk, and the baby that has no verbal communication skills, but yet it reaches anyway. It reaches maybe to be fed, maybe to, I don't know, I'm not a mother, so I don't know what else a baby might do, but I suppose it might say it's hungry by reaching out. But then as I was thinking about that, how miraculous we are that we're born with that innate instinct, that reflex to reach out to our caregivers, I was thinking, I was a little bit overwhelmed with sadness when I began to think, what about the babies that nobody reaches back to? What about the baby that's not responded to? What happens to that baby? And that kind of, for me, is really ideas around when we talk about some of the family elements where maybe some of this stuff comes from. Maybe it comes from trauma growing up, maybe it doesn't. But I was just so profoundly struck by how do we talk about all of those babies that are reaching and no one's reaching back? And Pablo also was talking about this yesterday. And I think it goes into our larger conversation, not so much about infants and our knowledge of childhood development, but it goes into our entire culture and how we're bringing people into this world and how we're holding them and holding each other while we're here. I'm going to try to advance a slide, watch. So I guess the arrow that points down advances. So some people have said that I have a thought disorder. I just think that doesn't make any sense. Shouldn't the thing pointing up be the way to go forward? Some people have said that I have profound mental illness. I understand that here it's referred to as psychosocial disability. I'm hoping that this slide I created because it feels comfortable to me, and it feels probably like how I always feel in life. Like I'm that duckling. I don't ever really know what to do or how to do it. I just keep showing up every day anyway. Yes. See, even if you have profound thought disorders or what they call mental illness or psychosis or several personality disorders, we're still quick learners. To me, this is so important, and it overlaps with ideas around open dialogue and also ideas of intentional peer support that, like this slide says, collaboration is creating something that could have been much better. Is the word for that? I'm going to defer to some of the doctors in the room. A synergistic effect. It's bigger than the separate elements. Chris and some others have talked about this, and we're going to keep talking about perspective, power, and privilege. Pablo is going to talk more tomorrow about the Parachute Project. I began working on a mobile crisis and needs adapted treatment model team was my first job after I had been on disability for several years. In 2008, I had a very interesting year where I was involuntarily hospitalized 5 times in 9 months, and was not really ever given any indication that I would be any better. I think that I'm a lot better today. And so the work strikes me as being so meaningful and so important because it's so different, and I can stand here as a very nervous, very anxious, very frightened person, and I can tell you when I'm sitting in a room with a network and a family and a person that hopefully it may be experiencing psychosis, because to me that's my thing I communicate with best. Working this way has such a profound effect on individuals, and oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly enough, especially on families. As somebody that works as a peer support person, I came into Parachute really, like I said, on disability, federal disability. I had not worked in quite some time. And I went through my training at a place in Harlem called Howie the Harp, which is about a 500-hour classroom training and a 3-month internship as a peer support specialist. So I came out of that pretty fired up. It's where I learned about things like intentional peer support and the psychiatric survivor movement, and I first was sprinkled with the drops of water that I can swim in. And people often ask me, so what's next for you? What do you want to do next? And I say, man, this is what I want to be doing this. This is what I like doing. I like working as a peer support person. I'm now so fortunate that I supervise a team that's peer support specialists, and I hope to be a part of expanding the work in my home state, which is now Vermont. And maybe through some kind of foreign exchange peer program, we can rile each other up across the globe. It's an idea we kind of came up with last night at dinner, that together we can really encourage one another in these areas where maybe peer support, the role isn't that defined. People might not understand the importance of it, and people might even think we don't belong where the clinicians are. So that's where some of this power, perspective, and privilege comes in. When I started working on the Parachute team, we were on the 22nd floor, and the psychiatrist asked to speak with me. It was my second day on the job, and the psychiatrist said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." So the psychiatrist took me in a back hallway where nobody else would be listening, and she said to me, "I was one of your treating resident psychiatrists when you were in the hospital." So how many people are in New York City? A lot. 8 million? And I end up at my second day of the job with the psychiatrist saying, "Hey, I was your treating psychiatrist when you were in the hospital." And I got kind of a kick out of it, because what I said to her was, I said, like, I have absolutely no memory of you. And this, I think, affected her profoundly when she realized that I had no memory of her fabulousness as a psychiatric resident at Weill Cornell Payne Whitney Hospital. So she and I never really got along. And when Chris was talking about putting things in place for people to come to work that have psychosocial disabilities and how to manage that in the workplace and how to provide support and employment opportunities, my supervisor was very supportive, and he asked me, you know, is this going to be a problem for you? And I said, it's not a problem for me, but I think she's pretty uncomfortable with the idea of having a patient as a coworker. I love being somebody with a psychosocial disability, working side by side with psychiatrists and social workers. I am not somebody that wants to stay outside. I respect greatly my peers and the activist community, psychiatric survivor activist community, who's really, I stand on their shoulders, and I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for all the work that has gone on for so many years. So I'm not trying to blend in. I'm not trying to be less than a person with, I'm not used to the language of psychosocial disability. I just call myself crazy. I am not trying to pretend that I don't have that, but I think when we work together, what I like so much is I almost become a, I got it. I don't need that one. I almost become a translator of sorts. And I think the best way to talk about my work sometimes is through actual stories of actual things that have happened. In New York City, the team was 3 peer specialists, a family therapist, a psychiatrist, and I believe 4 social workers. And through the building of the Parachute Project, it was very much, there had to be peer specialists on the teams, the mobile treatment teams. There was no way out of it. So I think this was the first time people really merged in quite this way to really seriously not only have interdisciplinary conversations, but do interdisciplinary work in the field. So Chris earlier referenced my depth of experience with facilitating social network meetings, and that's because over the course of 5 years, I probably have co-facilitated over 400 meetings. Now, I always partner with a very talented psychiatrist or social worker so that I have the easy job of doing what I do. But having said that, it's been an amazing experience and such a shift when you think about it. I was facilitating a meeting in the hospital in an inpatient unit just a couple of weeks ago, and in this inpatient unit, in this particular meeting, there were 2 psychiatrists, a psychiatric resident, a psychiatric nurse in charge, an outpatient social worker, a person of concern, the parents, my colleague, and another social worker. And I was facilitating the meeting. And so let's just, think about that for a moment. What can happen is not that my skills are so much better, they're probably quite worse. But when everybody in the room started talking about this person who's currently in the hospital experiencing really horrible internal messages, sort of encouraging them to light themselves on fire, which is a very horrible idea, right? So the conversation had gone to how much this person is still bothered by that and how much every medication hasn't worked and all of these things that haven't worked. And then I offered, I might say that it has been working because you have been surviving and you are here with us today. And people in the room were a little bit confused by that, and I was thinking like, that's how different our thinking can be sometimes, because I'm thinking like, as someone who's had those experiences of having internal stimuli commanding me to jump off the Verrazano Bridge in New York City, which is a fairly serious bridge. People do survive that jump. That just walking down the street in a straight line is an achievement, is a success. And I think that's sometimes what we might miss in our services and our plans that we build for people and our treatment team meetings and our this and that, like we're trying to apply ideas and goals and like recovery objectives that work for people that are well, that make sense and work for people that don't have these experiences. But do they work for us? Sometimes I think they do. And the look in this person's face when I said, but perhaps you have been dealing with it, because the conversation was, I'm not dealing with this well enough. I'm not getting over this. As though somehow we can make our bodies respond to medications differently or anything like that. And then when I put that switch on it and said, but maybe you really are dealing with it. Now we start to have a very different conversation. I get to do those meetings as part of the work that goes with this slide. In the state of Vermont, they've created what's called a collaborative network approach model, very much informed by open dialogue, very much informed by the needs adapted treatment model. As somebody that had so much experience in New York City, I'm kind of called upon in the agency to be like sort of a freelance social network meeting facilitator, which is great, and I'm also a trainer. I've gotten to meet so many amazing people through these opportunities. But you know, at the end of the day, I'm seen as kind of a mental patient by a lot of my clinical colleagues. I just keep showing up anyway. And I think I'm paid more than quite a number of them. So I constantly reflect on my own thoughts about my work. And again, going to what we were talking about with the baby and the reaching, it really made me think that perhaps a baby doesn't really care what I say. That perhaps a baby would have no way of interpreting or knowing what I say or responding to what I say. But maybe the baby reaches for the most basic, most important thing: contact with another person, touch and connection. So this is going to be very helpful for me when I go back to work, because I'm going to really use it as a reminder to try to break my bad habit of going into my own head to try to find the perfect words, the perfect... And when I do that, I'm stepping away from the conversation, aren't I? I'm stepping away from you if I'm trying to be in me, finding the best, most brilliant words. And this is really going to stick with me to just get myself out of the way and remember that perhaps it really is that simple, that it's not about what I say, but it's about that I respond. And that's one of the very basic things that I think is taught in open dialogue that people just struggle with so much. And I think that's where we can all work together. I don't know why, if it's about dialogue and it's about something that babies do, reaching out for connection, and if it's something our four-legged family members do, who's to say peers can't be helpful and effective in this work? Who says that we don't have a way of bringing something additional into the meeting? Something not better than, not less than, but something specific to us that's really, really, I think, very important to have in the work. I don't have a lot of research or data. When I was working in the parachute program and they were collecting data, I had suggested that it might be interesting to collect data on the outcomes for people that were having meetings co-facilitated by a peer and people that were having meetings co-facilitated by two clinicians. I thought that might be some interesting data to capture, but there was no interest in that. So we'll keep going forward anyway, right? because I think we would have seen a difference. I think we would have seen a difference in the data. I'll tell you what else is amazing. More often than not, if I'm in a meeting, I come into the meeting just like any other mental health service provider. I don't necessarily wear a badge that says I'm psycho. But when the family, it's often the moms and the fathers too, but so often the moms, when they realize that I'm somebody that's been hospitalized repeatedly, when they realize I'm somebody that's been completely lost to this stuff, whatever it is, we don't even have a language for it. They want to know more about that. For the first time, they're seeing that maybe their person will be doing something again. And we've got to keep providing people that message. That's why I'm up here in this very uncomfortable stage, in this very nervous-making position, because people are not hearing, family members are not hearing that people can, I'll use the language of recovery, because once I was the person that ran out of the house with no shoes on, barefoot, cut off shorts, no pocketbook, because the voices were screaming to me that I was in immediate danger, and the computer was flashing at me, you have to run. And not only was it you have to run, but it was flashing now, 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 now. And I remember it so vividly because it was summertime and it was really, really, really warm, and I was just darting around this part of Brooklyn. And I had had a phone conversation with my brother in the midst of all of this, and we grew up, my mother has been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a state hospital, same with very other members of her family. So I feel like my brother should have known a little better, but I said to him, I think Jeff's trying to kill me. My world had become filled with ideas that my boyfriend, who I love dearly, was the Green River Killer, which is a very famous killer in, I think, Oregon somewhere. And then he became a little more important than that. He became like a huge leader of all of the satanic cults on the East Coast. So this was very frightening and very, very immediate. And one of the really strong images that I remember in the computer was I was typing furiously back at the computer as it was telling me that I needed to leave, that I was in danger, and I wrote one time, and it was weird things like the computer was telling me that my boyfriend was poisoning my eye cream, Lancome eye cream and cosmetics and stuff, and I was just thinking oh, it's starting to make sense now. Yeah. And so the computer was saying, you must go now, hurry, and I typed back, okay, but I have to go brush my teeth. Isn't that funny? I think that's very funny. And then the computer, I swear, said back to me, it said, no time for vanity. I swear to God it said that. So I had somehow, the superintendent of the building knew something was up and let me use his phone, and I called my brother in Florida, and I said to my brother, I think Jeff's trying to kill me, and my brother, being a real smart aleck, I hope that translates, said, I don't know, Les, maybe he is. So I took that for the truth. And that's when I started darting about Brooklyn, and he told me, we have a different way of viewing the world, and he told me, I don't know, Les, you got to listen to God and your gut. So I was traveling around Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, looking for God. And that was difficult because as I would enter churches, I suddenly felt like it was a trick, and they were really cultists and stuff. So as fun as this story is, this involved police a couple of times, and no one was able to fix me, but the couple of things that I want to mention about that particular incident is I had called the police on myself. And they came and they were sitting with me, New York Police Department officers sitting with me in the curb. And this officer had on mirrored Ray-Ban glasses, sunglasses. And he looked down at me and he said, "I think my glasses might be freaking you out, so I'm going to take them off." And he did. Now, for me, that's lucky I'm a white woman in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. I don't know that some of my clients would have had that same experience. But it does remind me of one thing that we get so confused over. Oh, somebody's in a state. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Hey, maybe offer a glass of water. Maybe gently say, "Is there anything that I could do to make you feel a little more comfortable?" I lost my next thought. But I wonder, oh, this is a good one. I don't know what happened in translation with my slides. Like, I don't know why they're cut off. But this should say something else, I think. Peers plus clinicians equals innovation. So that's what Pablo is going to talk more about tomorrow. And that's what Chris talked about a little bit. That's what I like to talk about a lot. When we worked on the parachute team, we struggled a lot. We struggled a lot with language. We struggled a lot with who gets to determine what, who gets to set appointments, who gets to make final decisions. We encountered, as people that have been patients, we encountered a lot of language and a lot of description that felt horrible to us. I can't. No, this is a new one, isn't it? Oh no, I don't go in order. Didn't you hear me earlier? I said I have a thought disorder. I'm sorry. We're struggling up front here because I'm not like kind of speaking in a way that matches the slides or something. I'm not even sure what's happening. Can I continue or is it too distracting? Huh? Well, now I feel a little off my game. I think that's kind of an example, right? Like, who's to say my slides can't be totally mixed up? What are you guys going to do, throw rotten tomatoes? Let's go to what other people have had to say. Sandy Steingart is the Chief Medical Officer of the agency I work at. I've gotten official permission to go off script and do whatever I want. Which people that know me know that's what I do. I always do that. Anyway, Dr. Sandra Steingart is an amazing person. She's the Chief Medical Officer of Howard Center, which is a designated agency in Vermont that employs about 1,300 people, I believe, and very, very large for the very small state. Sandy went and studied open dialogue with Mary Olson in Massachusetts a few years ago, became very, very, very interested in this other way of working. She's really gone on to champion these ideas around releasing some of the professional privilege. She's edited and released a book called Critical Psychiatry. I would encourage people to check that out. And Sandy is the person that recruited me to Vermont from New York. And she will say this to people repeatedly. She will tell her colleagues that are psychiatrists and very well trained and very well educated and very compassionate and impassioned clinicians that she has learned the most in working this way from me. They don't say that as a point of bragging. I only say that because it's true. She said, people say that what they learn from me is that I don't have any other tools. When we talk about watching body language, when we talk about watching eyes, when we talk about when people sigh or stop breathing, that's the only language I know. So that's the way I respond to people in meetings. And I think it's helped my colleagues get a lot more comfortable working that way too. Some people will recognize this name. Jay Mills was my supervisor from day one, and he was an amazing, amazing part of why I was able to remain engaged in work and stay working. There were some times in the first few weeks, first few months, where it was very iffy with me. I'm a very tough, strong, hard, mean kind of person, but it almost brings tears to my eyes, the way he took me under his wing. And he would say at times, "It's cool, it's okay, if you're having a moment, just leave." And I was like, what? I can leave? And he was one of the people, I think, as I understand the stories, because I came on the team after they started this training that Chris was talking about, with clinicians being trained in intentional peer support and everybody being trained together in the same rooms. As I understand it, Jay was quite demonstrative with his dislike for some of what was happening and what he was being told to do. And I think he absolutely, actually, as I understand the story from himself, told our lead NATM trainer that this was stupid. Jay went on to be a great leader of our team. He and I co-facilitated so many meetings together, and we did so much really, really, really nice work together. And he is still connected to the work, and he went through the train the trainer for New York City NATM model, and I did that as well. 36 people, I believe, at the city level of people in parachute wanted to become trainers, I think, as many as that. I think 8 of us received certificates. And I'm happy to say I'm one of those 8 people. There was one other peer that's in there, so we are 2 peers of 8 people in the world, really, that have this particular certificate. So Jay and I talk a lot, and he was really wishing me luck here. Jay's words really speak for themselves. What's not said on the slide is it's incredibly painful to be the person in a room of 6 or 7 colleagues, many of whom are so much more respected and have so much more education and years and years and years of experience behind them, to find the courage to say, wow, that really hurts my feelings. One of the first incidences we had of that, and I don't know if this will translate, but I'm going to say it anyway, being that we were refashioned mobile crisis teams, we would get referrals and people would read the case notes, the referrals as it were, and it'd be symptom, 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 behavior problem, whatever, diagnosis. So one day we were in team meeting and one of the social workers was reading it and she just kept saying, has been observed laughing inappropriately, observed with inappropriate laughter. And I think after the fourth or maybe even fifth time, I almost rose out of my seat and I said, listen, if I'm hallucinating and you have a red clown nose on your face, is my laughter inappropriate? Maybe, maybe not. And Jay tells that story in his work and in trainings now, and I think it's such a simple example of how we all can do well to remember we might not know what we think we know. Another way I really like, another really important couple of quick anecdotes before my time is up. I think this is one of Chris's favorite stories. I don't know how Pablo feels about it, but maybe I'll find out later. The team had been working with a gentleman. He had been diagnosed as with paranoid schizophrenia. He was considered never to get well. He was considered to be chronic, hopeless. And the parachute team started working with him. Another peer was on that case, if you will, and the person was able to express that they thought maybe it would be neat to talk to somebody with experiences more like their own. And this person was very non-communicative, very just staring straight ahead. And so I think that my colleagues were not expecting much, and I was very scared. It's a very frightening work to feel like I have no qualifications and I should be yanked out of the room at any moment. And when I said something to him about, I remember when I was like hallucinating one time and it was really bad and I've seen devils and ghouls and everything, he just turned his head completely and looked at me. And my colleagues were like, we have never seen him do that before. And I think the three of us went on to do some really nice work with this person. I've spoken about this person in London in the UK because I'm pretty fancy too, and I've been asked to travel before. He did end up needing to be hospitalized, and he was getting more and more aggressive. He was a person of color, a tall man, disheveled. And in New York City, that often doesn't end well. I don't know how it is here in Taiwan. I hope it's better. Sometimes in New York City and other places, people just get killed. So he lived in an apartment, not so large, one-bedroom apartment. I was going to stay out of the intervention. Being a peer, I didn't really want to be involved in the hospitalization. I was standing in the hallway just kind of observing it. I went downstairs, I came back up on the elevator, and there were people in the elevator like acting like they were going to start fighting, and they were the police officers. Anyway, I went and stood with our person. There were at one point like maybe 8 New York City police officers in the apartment, his family members, yelling, a lot of chaos going on. It was really intense. Like the police were really getting very close to moving in on this person. And I just got to a point where I just pushed through the police and I went and stood with our person in the corner and I said, listen, I have no idea that this is like a horrible situation to be in, but I can tell you nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here. And the police were very, very angry. My colleagues were very, very angry. My supervisor was very, very angry. But our guy got to walk down to the ambulance with putting his own shoes on and putting his own clothing on and no handcuffs, no tasering, no shooting. And I think that because I'm a peer, I was able to do that, where I think sometimes the clinicians have such different licensing and such different things that they could lose if they act out of turn. And I was told in disciplinary sort of way that I should never do something like that again. And I said, well, I can tell you I would do that again. So my time is up. I'm going to get a little plug in for a documentary film I'm in. It's by the Hot Stove Project, 2 wonderful women in New York City. It's called Daniel, Deborah, Leslie, and You. And it's currently being screened, and there's a link, information on the link in the materials. So thank you for listening, and thank you for bearing with my difficulties in presenting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your story. 谢谢我们讲者带来他的故事。接下来是我们的 Q&A 时间。Next part we will have a Q&A section. So if there's any questions you would like to ask, please raise your hands. 如果有任何问题的话，可以现在举手。Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, I will directly pose my question.
我用中文提问好了，因为想说就是就是大家可以比较直接听到，就是我要问的问题，就是说，就是在同儕的关系里面，通常我们会很在意就是平等，就是有一个平等的关系。那当像是在有拿到薪资。然后就有 payment 的同儕支持员的位阶的时候，碰到他就可能是作为一个service provider，作为那个服务的提供者，那其他的同儕来可能是像是服务的使用者，那像这样的一个关系看起来就好像不太一样，有时候来的同儕可能会觉得，哇，你是比较专业的。你是 professional 啊，你甚至你可能是权威，你是 authority 之类的。那在这样子的时候，要怎么样去思考所谓平等的意涵，或者是要怎么让那个关系的权利去流动？那像这样的问题，可能是会觉得我会很好奇的这样子。
That's a really good question.
这个问题非常棒。
And we talk a lot about power. And the fact that, and I'm not sure how this will translate, but in English we say, we are not equal. None of us are equal, but we have equity. And which is, it's like if you have twins and one loves to play on computers and one loves to play soccer, and you give them both a piano or piano lessons for gifts. Equity is about acknowledging what each of us needs and finding, acknowledging firstly the power, and there is power in having a role, there is power in being paid, and being able to talk about it and talk about how can we have a relationship where both of us learn and grow. So you're absolutely right. It's not an equal relationship, and it's dishonest almost to say that it is. But how can we talk about what it is that we share, and acknowledge that I can learn from you just as much as you learn from me. So some of it's in transparency and being able to talk openly and honestly about those issues. Do you have anything to that?
That's one of my areas where I have a lot of experience, is in directly supervising and employing peer support people. And I also did peer support supervision at Fountain House, New York City. And this is very important issues. The team I supervise, it's not uncommon for people to come right from the psychiatrist's office to wanting to work on the team. I think that's great. If it's a good fit, and if training is provided, and support and mentoring is provided, in our community, I would say I would say almost every person on the team I supervise also receives services in the agency. So as Chris was saying, yes, you have to acknowledge that this is a paid position, that we're providers. It does change, in my opinion, the relationship, and we're very clear about that at the beginning. But it also provides quite a lot of interesting hope for other people in the agency that think they might never work again. Not saying that all people that are clients or patients should be peer support specialists, but to me, it's one of the best parts of the job is welcoming people onto the team that have not worked in a long time and that are finding a way to take this risk.
And there are some advantages to volunteer positions because there are not those differences. But there's a piece of social justice around being able to pay people and acknowledge the work that they're doing, particularly people who have lived in poverty and for most of their lives, that I quite like, so kind of rebalancing some of that injustice and acknowledging that what you have to give, to offer to me, is equally of value as the social worker or the psychiatrist or the case manager. Well, it's not equally, I've just said, but it is also of value, and sometimes it's what I need the most. So being able to have that payment is actually, to me, it's also about social justice.
Yes, over here.
Hanson 小姐，您刚刚提到了强迫的，当你去强迫一个人的时候，是违反的人权，特别是 CRPD 身心障碍者权利公约的第14条。那同儕支持可以怎么样帮助一个病人？
The condition is value. Thank you.
When the condition is, I didn't catch that last word. Oh, in critical condition. So I think Leslie touched on that. Is that sometimes you can connect when nobody else can, and sometimes everybody else is responding from a position of fear and from a position of power and from a position of an intent to control, because that's what they've been trained to do. And if I can come in and do something different, I think that's powerful. And I would like to see, this is just a little project that I've got, I'd like to see us start to acknowledge and capture the moments when we all do that. So each one of us, I'm sure, at times has managed to connect with a person who's in a very critical or very extreme state, and we often don't remember, we don't acknowledge it, we don't tell those stories. But I think we should. I think we should capture them a bit like capturing a butterfly and keeping it, because those are precious stories. And I think those are also some of the ways that we will start to challenge the compulsory treatment and the culture that we have of locking people up because it's easiest. And I think all of us have that ability to be able to connect within us.
Another example I was going to give, but I was so terribly nervous behind that podium. I should have been able to sit down maybe. We had been working with somebody for quite some time, about 1.5 years. This is in my current work. And the person was experiencing an ordeal, is a language that we created together, she and I, for what her experience is. We agreed that we could say that it's some sort of ordeal. And she had been picked up by the police because she was walking very, very late at night and getting kind of far away from where she lives. So immediately the response is, how can we save her? What should we do? What can we do? We must get her. And I simply asked her, where were you going? She said she was going to India, by the way. But by me saying that and her having that chance to answer, then she broke into a big smile and she started talking and she used her hands and she said, like, on the one hand, I knew, like, I can't really walk to India, that it would require a plane. We're having a really different interaction now.
OK， 在我们结束之前，我想要
Did you ever know when I started receiving messages from the TV?
Only when you let me know. But there was like the strip, that bottom running strip that you were seeing.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't there. Who wants to admit that their brain may not be functioning? I mean, that's the real terror of this thing.
Do you still hear voices?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Every day. Like I tell my parents, like, oh, it's less today or yesterday. And sometimes it is.
I think that's what madness is, that disconnect between your true self and the self others proclaim you to be or want you to be. When you do discover the real you, you find you don't like them very much.
Really interesting and I think really important thing about the recovery notion, the recovery movement, is that it started with people who had histories of serious mental illnesses who recovered. And they saw that they could, and they did not expect that because they'd never been told that you could get better with a mental illness. They were typically put in hospitals against their will. They eventually got out of the hospitals and had not found the hospitals to be very helpful, needless to say. So here was a group of people who had these conditions, who had gotten their lives back, and here was a medical psychiatric establishment that was saying that was not possible.
My brain is an organ. We have organs, kidneys, lungs, and a heart. And if any one of those particular organs are defective or you get ill, you go for a treatment program. For your kidney, you go for kidney dialysis. For our brain, we have a mental illness and we get treatments.
So would you be talking out loud to nobody?
Sometimes.
And so
Yeah.
would people respond to you, or they sort of give you that look?
They would give me that look.
Yeah.
Kiss of death. I don't get angry at people. Outwardly.
Yeah.
Where did you get this idea about schizophrenia?
Because that's just what they called it. Like my parents and the doctors. So yeah.
How did they tell you that? I'm just interested.
I don't know. I told them about the voices and it's like, you have schizophrenia. So I'm like, okay, that works. Well, not really that works, but...
Shall we thank our speakers with an applause?
So we will end the session. Thank you very much.